Yesterday we got a new Lotus. Today we get a new Jitte. What is going on with Outlaws of Thunder Junction and the big score? Let's discuss. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoilers. So we're slowly creeping towards the end of spoiler season, but we still have about half of the big score set to go. So today we got a bunch more mythics to talk about, including some really interesting, playable, and exciting stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new magic cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag it from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should mosey on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk about Outlaws of Thunder Junction and the big score. First up today, we get a new Jitte in Lost Jitte. So 1 mana to cast, 1 mana to equip legendary equipment. When a equipped creature deals combat damage, not to a player, just any combat damage. So if you hit an opponent's creature or whatever, you get blocked, still get a charge counter on it. And then you can remove a charge counter from it to untap a land, or make it so target creature can't block this turn, or put a +1/+1 counter on equipped creature. So obviously, this is a reference to one of the most iconic and powerful equipments in the history of the game in Umezawa's Jitte, which is 2 mana to cast, 2 to equip, and kinda does the same thing, except you get 2 charge counters and you can pump a creature, kill small creatures, or gain some life. I will say, Lost Jitte is not going to be as good as Umezawa's Jitte. I just don't think that's actually possible. The abilities on Umezawa's Jitte made it so hard to deal with because you can remove a charge counter, and remember you get 2 with each combat damage rather than just 1, but you can remove a counter to give a creature +2/+2 until end of turn, which means if you put this on a small creature, you can just get in combat damage with it, and the next turn pump it to like a 5/5 or a 6/6, which just makes it so hard to block, so easy to snowball. Plus you can snipe small creatures on your opponent's side of the battlefield. Lost Jitte isn't going to quite have that same snowball effect. Yes, you get a counter, which you can use to put a single +1/+1 counter on a equipped creature, or you can use it to make an opponent's creature not block, which on some board states will let you get in another hit and get another counter. I think the big mode on this is really the untap a land mode. That's the mode on Lost Jitte that makes me think this card can be incredibly good in the right decks. Also worth mentioning, it's costed like a bone splitter, so 1 to cast, 1 to equip is about as cheap as it gets. So if you look at the modes of this card, you essentially get to untap a land, so twiddle a land basically, or like panic spellbomb one of your opponent's creatures, or I guess battle growth the equipped creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. The biggest mode is definitely that untap land mode, but in standard, I think the big payoff here is probably a +1/+1 counter theme deck. We have a ton of pieces for a +1/+1 counter deck, a bunch of new ones coming from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, but when you add in Ozolith and Botanical Brawler, I could certainly see this seeing play, and a deck that's just all about putting counters on its creatures seems really good in that context. Once you get back to older formats, I think the main reason to be excited about this is Urza's Saga. So this is another equipment like Shadow Sphere that is cheap enough you can find it with Urza's Saga. Urza's Saga, one of the strongest cards in Modern, really good in Commanders. He's playing Legacy and Vintage and so forth. So I think that Lost Jitte, it's not as good as Shadow Sphere in a generic deck. If you're just playing like Modern Hammer Time, I think like some massive percentage of the time, you'd rather just get Shadow Sphere, put it on your construct, gain like 8 life or whatever, trample over for a ton of damage. But I think that Lost Jitte still serves a purpose in Urza's Saga decks, and it might be good enough to show up alongside Shadow Sphere. So I don't think it replaces Shadow Sphere, but it can show up alongside of it because it does have a lot of really interesting shenanigans. So the most powerful thing this card does is untap lands that make multiple mana. So what I'm envisioning is you use probably Urza's Saga to find your Lost Jitte, and then you store up a couple of charge counters, and then you have a turn where you like Nykthos multiple times, Gaia's Cradable multiple times, use your Lotus Field multiple times, and that's probably going to win you the game. It's also super good with Urza's Saga. Not only can you find it with Urza's Saga with the last lore counter, but you can also use this to untap your Urza's Saga to make even more constructs, which is a really powerful effect. There's also the possibility that this card could see play in decks that don't even really attack with creatures. So there's this weird Dice Factory deck in Modern that's all about like moving counters onto things, charge counters in specific, with stuff like Surge Node and Power Conduit. Lost Jitte could work there because remember, its abilities, outside of the +1/+1 counter one, which does apply to the equipped creature, but its abilities don't require it to be attached to a creature. So you could theoretically just have this sit on the battlefield and like use Surge Node to put a counter counter on it, or Power Conduit to put a counter on it, and then use it to untap your lands or mess with your opponent's blockers or whatever. So maybe it's good enough in that context as well, because in the Dice Factory deck, you're really good at adding counters to things and really good at proliferating. There's also some cute interactions with Power Conduit, Lost Jitte, in Urza's Saga, where Power Conduit can tap to remove a counter from a permanent to put a charge counter on something. So what you can do is use Power Conduit to remove a counter from Urza's Saga to keep it on the battlefield, put that counter on Lost Jitte, and then use the counter from Lost Jitte to untap the Urza's Saga to make another construct. So you actually kind of set up this weird infinite double construct thing going where you just overwhelm your opponent with constructs. So Lost Jitte, thankfully, this card is not going to just break the game like original Jitte, but I do think this card is really playable. I'm most hyped for it outside of Standard, in like Modern, in Legacy, Commander decks, formats where Urza's Saga is around, because it works so well with Urza's Saga, but I do think it could serve a purpose in Standard as well, specifically in a +1/+1 counter deck. Speaking of sweet artifacts, we also got Collector's Cage. So Collector's Cage is a 2-mana white hideaway artifact. So when it ETBs, you'll get your top 5 cards, you exile one face down, the rest go on the bottom, and then you can pay 1 and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, and then if there's 3 or more creatures with different powers, you can play the exiled card for free. So this card is another hideaway card. We've had essentially 2 cycles of these cards in Magic. Right now in Standard, we have like the fight rigging cycle of enchantments. In some ways, Collector's Cage is actually more like the original land cycle, in that you can activate it at instant speed. So fight rigging and the rest of the enchantments essentially trigger whenever they trigger. So it's going to happen with fight rigging at the beginning of combat, like that's when it's going to happen. Collector's Cage, though, once you meet its requirement, you can just leave up a mana, and at any time you can tap it, put a counter on something, and cast that card for free. So this is a way you can be casting creatures during your opponent's turn, wraths during your opponent's turn, whatever you're trying to do. So that's a nice upside of this card. As far as what you do with this card, the ceiling is absurdly high. So let's say you're playing a deck in Standard where you go turn 1 Teething Wormlet, turn 2 you play Collector's Cage, which is going to grow your Teething Wormlet, turn 3 you go another Teething Wormlet into Ginger Brew, and to activate Collector's Cage, put a counter on something. That by itself is going to give you 3 creatures with different powers and the mana to activate Collector's Cage on turn 3, and you could be casting a turn 3 Portal to Phyrexia or a Troxer or whatever. So the ceiling on this card is absurdly high. This is turn 3 Atroxia ceiling. Of course, this is disruptible. Your opponent can kill your creatures and it falls apart. We've seen that with fight rigging, right? Like, how do you stop fight rigging? You just keep your opponent from having a big creature on the battlefield, and they never get to cast the hideaway card. So Collector's Cage is going to have that same issue, but when things go well, this can be a really fast game ender. Also, it seems good in +1/+1 counter decks. We've already been talking about, like, the Ozolith. We have fight rigging, so you could go full-on hideaway +1/+1 counters. So it seems like a good option there as well. So maybe some sort of, like, Botanical Brawler, Sovereign Onotech Owl deck. This could take advantage of Collector's Cage. The question's going to be, do you just use this for value? Is this like a fight rigging style of hideaway card, or is this more of just a value-y hideaway card where, like, I remember in Modern, people would play Windbrisk Heights, the white hideaway land, which makes your attack with 3 creatures to trigger. There would sometimes be meme brews where people would play like a token deck with Emrakuls and try to cast the Emrakul, but then also you'd sometimes just play it and be like, I'll cast another Lingering Souls, or I'll cast a Path to Exile, or whatever. You're getting a card for free either way, right? So maybe it's fine in Standard if you're not playing Atroxas and Portal to Phyrexias, and you're just playing a generic counter deck, and you just get a free, whatever, Botanical Brawler out of the deal, or Sovereign out of the deal. So maybe you don't have to, like, play this, you know, kind of meme-ish deck where you're like, I'm this aggro +1/+1 counter deck that also has these big uncastable things. Maybe that's not necessary to make this work. The big concern I do have with this is it does get got by a lot of removal, like Temporary Lockdown kind of wrecks it. Pest Control, we were talking about the like triple 1-drop, do it on turn 3 plan. Pest Control kind of wrecks that. Even just like Cut Down can keep creatures on the battlefield. If you think about Collector's Cage, it essentially has the Coven mechanic, and we've never really seen the Coven mechanic pop off. Like, it's just never been good, because getting 3 creatures with different powers on the battlefield is actually a lot harder than it sounds. It's not all that consistent. So we'll have to see how good it ends up being in practice. As far as Commander is concerned, seems sweet in +1/+1 counter decks. In Commander, your decks, even your aggro +1/+1 counter decks, are going to have some big bombs, right? That's just like how Commander works. So in Commander, you don't have to worry so much about like, oh, do I have this big uncastable stuff in my deck that I have in Standard? Like you might have to worry about with Collector's Cage if you're trying to play like +1/+1 counters in Standard. In Commander, you're just always going to have like your Crater Hoofs or whatever your big finishers are. So you don't have to really worry about that deck building restriction. You're going to have those big bombs in your deck. And this is just a way that you can add counters to things to synergize with your commander, and then maybe cast one of those big bombs for free. So Collector's Cage, I think this card's pretty good. I think this card's got a chance in Standard, and it seems super sweet in +1/+1 counter commander decks. We also got Molten Duplication. Talking about power creep, this is like literally a power creep card. So it is 1 and a red for a sorcery. This says create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. It gains haste until end of turn. Sack it at the beginning of the next end step. So Molten Duplication, it is actually literally just power crept Heat Shimmer. Like it's 1 less mana, plus it can target artifacts, plus the upside of turning the creature into an artifact matters with a lot of big score stuff. And Heat Shimmer is a card that actually was just bought out last week because people were already like preparing for wanting to make token copies of things because it synergizes so well with this set. And then Wizards gave us Molten Duplication, which is just a very strictly better version of Heat Shimmer. So as far as what you do with this card, first off, we've been talking throughout Big Score spoiler season about these really powerful cards that want you to make token copies of artifacts. Worldwaker Helm is probably the biggest of those, where for 2 mana, you can create a token that's a copy of target artifact token you control. Molten Duplication, for 2 mana, lets you turn any creature or artifact on your battlefield into an artifact until end of turn, which is a way you can then make a token of it with Worldwaker's Helm. So this is a way you can have a artifact, a Troxa, or a Tally, or whatever, and then pop off with your Worldwaker's Helm. Also, like Esoteric Duplicator cares about sacking artifacts. There's a lot of sweet synergies with the new Big Score cards. The other place this is going to be cute is in some commander decks. So it's really good in like the Master Multiplied, which will let you keep your token around through your end step since you don't have to sack stuff. Also kind of hilarious in Zada, where you like cast this targeting Zada, but then get a copy for each other creature you control. So you just make this huge board of Molten Duplication tokens. There's also some combo potential with like Nehru Miha Master Wizard or Dual Caster Mage, where the idea is you can take and use this to essentially copy those creatures an infinite amount of times. So you like put your Dual Caster Mage on the stack and then you Molten Duplicate it, and then your Molten Duplicate can keep copying the Dual Caster Mage, which will keep making more copies of it. So it kind of makes this weird Splinter Twin style combo where you're gonna get infinite hasty Dual Caster Mages. So that could be something to keep an eye out for on Magic Arena in specific, where maybe we see some sort of like Dual Caster Mage combo deck develop. We've seen them in the past. They've never like truly broken the format, but there's been some fringe combo decks built around Nehru Miha and Dual Caster Mage. Molten Duplication makes those decks way better just because it's a cheaper version of the combo effect. You can do it so much faster and so much more efficiently than in the past. So we'll have to wait and see. I think that might have ramifications on Arena in specific. So Molten Duplication, definitely not reinventing the wheel or anything. It's essentially a Heat Shimmer that has been upgraded for 2024, but a Heat Shimmer certainly has some uses, and doubly so with all the artifact token synergies in Big Score itself. Next up, we have a wacky black enchantment in Gamble of Greed. So Gamble of Greed, 4 mana, it's a black enchantment. It says when it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, gain 6 life, and make 3 2/1 black bat creature tokens with flying. So pretty absurd, right? For 4 mana, you get 3 2/1 flyers, 6 life, and 3 cards. The problem is, on your end step, you have to discard a card and lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature. And then, when it leaves the battlefield, you gotta discard 3 cards, lose 6 life, and sacrifice 3 creatures. So essentially, you lose 1/3 of what it gives you every turn. And if it leaves the battlefield, you lose all of what it gives you, which means if this sits on the battlefield for a bit and you have to like sack and discard and lose life, and then it leaves the battlefield, it can actually take away from you way more than it actually gives you. So how do you actually use this card? And I think the answer is it's got to be like a demonic pack card. There's no way you can just play this and get value out of it. Very hard to do. So I think this has to be a demonic pack style card where the goal is you play this and give it to your opponent. At first I was like, okay, what if we play this and like sack it to Braids or sack it to Beseech the Mirror? it just doesn't really work, right? You get these bats and life and cards, but then if you sack it to braids, you're going to lose the bats and life and cards. So it doesn't really put you ahead in any meaningful way. So it doesn't really work with most sack synergies. So I think the plan has to be like in standard, you play this, you get the value out of it, and hopefully immediately before you get to your end step, Coveted Falcon, give it to your opponent. Then your opponent's the one that's going to be sacrificing and losing life each turn. And if they get rid of it, they're going to lose a bunch of cards and a bunch of life and a bunch of creatures. So we'll have to see. We've already seen some like fringy Archfiend of the Dross Coveted Falcon decks in standard. Gamble of Greed seems like a really nice fit there. Same with like Harmless Offering or Donate can work as a backup to Demonic Pact. It's not as immediately game ending as Demonic Pact, but that's fine. It's still a good thing to give your opponent, and it is slowly going to eat away their resources. The one other way I found that you could take advantage of this is being able to sacrifice instant speed with its ETB trigger on the stack. So if you can play Gamble of Greed, and then you can use like Torch the Tower to bargain it away at instant speed, what you do is you put it into play, you put its trigger on the stack. So the trigger is going to say, draw 3 cards, gain 6 life, make 3 backs, and then you Torch the Tower, so you make it so the Leaves the Battlefield trigger resolves first. So you are going to have to discard 3 cards, which is kind of a bummer, but if you're empty-handed, that's kind of fine. You are going to lose 6 life, but you're going to gain that back when the first trigger resolves. And then you're going to sack 3 creatures, but if you don't have any creatures on the battlefield, that's not much of a drawback. And then, once you get through the negative Leaves the Battlefield trigger, then the Enters the Battlefield trigger will resolve, and you'll draw 3 cards, gain 6 life, and make 3 bats. Is it going to be worth the work to try to pull this off? It's going to take a specific deck, right? Like, the plan kind of falls apart if you have a bunch of creatures on the battlefield because you don't really want to sack them to make bats. It kind of falls apart if you got cards in hand you don't want to discard, but that is another way that you can kind of manipulate the stack to take advantage of this card and get around its big drawbacks. And the payoff is high, right? Like, the payoff when this is draw 3 cards, make 3 bats, and I guess break even on life, it's going to be hard to get around the life loss thing, but when the payoff is make 3 2/1 flyers and draw 3 cards, it's probably worth doing some janky brewing to make it work. So Gamble of Greed, I love cards like this. Like, it's going to be super hard to play. Definitely don't just jam this in a generic deck. It's going to hurt you more than it helps. But if you can find a way around its end step trigger and its Leaves the Battlefield trigger, it can actually be a pretty powerful build around. We also got Bristlebud Farmer, a 4-mana 5/5 plant druid. It has trample. When it ETBs, you make 2 foods because it's a farmer, and then when it attacks, you can sack a food. If you do, you mill 3 cards and put a permanent card from among them onto your hand. This is a card that I feel like should be absurd. Like, I don't know why I'm not more excited for this card. Like, remember, in the early days of Magic, we're talking 30 years ago, Urnam Jin, a 4-mana 4/5 that doesn't have trample or anything, and has a drawback of essentially making one of your opponent's creatures unblockable each turn, was one of the best threats in existence in Magic. Now I see Bristlebud Farmer, a 4-mana 5/5 trampler with an ETB trigger and an attack trigger, and I'm kind of like, yeah, it's pretty good. That might be okay. That might be fine in a certain deck. So I feel like this should be a card that's like, oh my god, this card is so ridiculous. When instead I'm kind of like, yeah, it seems okay. If you think about it, 4-mana 5/5 trample, actually very above the curve stats, even for 2024. We have like Phyrexian Obliterator, but that's 4 black mana. We have Advent of the Worm, which did have the upside of being instant speed, but the downside was it was a token, so it could get like Vapor Snagged and goes away forever. But a 4-mana 5/5 trample is already a very solid stat line, even today. Plus, you get multiple upsides on this card where you're making food that can gain life or turn into card advantage with the attack trigger. I do love that Wizards has intentionally designed a bunch of these cards to work against Shieldred. Shieldred was like the biggest issue in Standard for a long time, and being a 4/5 for 4 shut down so many green creatures. It really kept mono green out of the format almost altogether. That combined with all the Wraths in Standard. But at least Wizards now is making like 4-mana 5/5s in green, which, yes, is kind of power creepy, but also gives you cards that can actually compete against a Shieldred deck. So I really love that aspect of the card. We also have some food synergies in Standard, left over from Wilds of Eldraine mostly, but like Knight of Sweet's Revenge, Greta cares about food, Food Fight works really well with food, so maybe this can be a 4-drop in some sort of food style deck. The last mode is essentially like a mini Wasteful Harvest. You can only grab the cards from among the cards you milled, which means you are kind of limited, but still you should get something, right? Because it's any permanent. So you can grab a creature, a planeswalker, artifact, enchantment. Worst case, you can grab a land. So you do generate a lot of value with that attack trigger. The question is going to be, how does this line up with other green 4-drops in the format. And honestly, the green 4-drop slot is not that insane. If you look at the green 4-drops, most of them have the problem we were talking about earlier. Like Axebane, Ferox, even Oddity read like good cards, but they're not actually good cards because they just get stonewalled by Shieldred. 4/4s don't do really well against 4 or 5s, so they kind of get pushed out of the format. Blossoming Tortoise is really good, but it cares about something different than Bristlebud Farmer. It's a smaller creature, it's only a 3/3, it's more about ramping. Doomscar Warrior hasn't really taken off. We have seen Hulking Raptor a little bit, mostly in dinosaur decks, but I actually think Bristlebud Farmer, even discounting being like a food deck that can really take advantage of its synergies, this might actually just be the best green 4-drop in the format. So I think it could see play in generic decks alongside food decks. It also seems good in commander decks that specifically care about foods or that token production, like Sophia Dogged Detective really wants you to make a bunch of artifact tokens so you can grow your dogs, and then this can get stuff back from the graveyard as well. Or No Master Chef, Samwise Gamgee, a bunch of different Lord of the Rings cards. So Bristlebud Farmer, the card's actually pretty good. Like, I don't know, I feel like I should be even more excited about it because it is pretty power creepy. It's got so much decks, it does so much things, but I'm still a little skeptical that just green has been so bad in Standard that maybe this isn't enough. But I will say, if you look at the green cards from this set, it does seem like Wizards has intentionally designed them to try to give green a chance in Standard. So we'll have to see if it's enough. If it is, Bristlebud Farmer very well might be part of it. It's a 4-mana 5/5 trampler with a huge amount of upside. Speaking of green cards, we also got Sandstorm Scrapper. So a 3-mana 1/1, when ATBs, you make a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token, then you pay 2, tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and they gain trample until end of turn. So Sandstorm Scrapper, it's essentially like a new take on Bladesplacer. Bladesplacer, more than a decade old now, but still a pretty reasonable card. It's just a 3-mana 1/1 that makes a 3/3. The difference is Bladesplacer just gives all your golems first strike, so the token it makes has first strike. Sandstorm Scrapper has a different upside, where if it sits out, it can just be growing your team with counters and giving your team trample every single turn for 2 mana, which is actually pretty efficient. So I think Sandstorm Scrapper, it's a pretty reasonable card. There's synergies for it. It's good with like Panharmonicon effects. You get double the golems with Elish Norn. Works well with Blink effects where you can get another golem out of it. Works well with doubling season effects to get more golems out of it. So there are a lot of synergies, and it's not a bad card on its own. It's adding 2 bodies and 4 total power and toughness to the battlefield for 3 mana, and you get the upside of its extra ability. I think its Standard, once again, seems good in counter decks. It adds 2 bodies to get counters on, and then it puts counters on everything. Plus, giving trample is really, really huge. I can imagine a creature like Bristlebud Spinesower getting really, really big in Standard. The problem is, it can still just be chump block though, right? But Sandstorm Scraper kind of gets around that issue, because you can just give your Bristlebud trample and smash in and kill your opponent with 1 huge trampling attack. Also seems sweet in golem-based commander decks like Bernard or Iktiki. I don't think there's a lot of commander homes. At first I was like, would I play this in a Blink deck? And I think the answer is no. I think I would have played it in a Blink deck like 10 years ago. Like when Rune first came out, I probably would have played Sandstorm Scrapper. But I think we've just gotten enough good ETB cards and Blink cards that I'm not sure a Bladesplacer style effect really makes it in a Blink deck anymore. But if you have synergies specifically for golems, then I think this card is great. So Sandstorm Scraper seems like a solid 3-drop. We'll have to see if it actually makes it in Constructed, but the comparison to Bladesplacer I think is a pretty good one. And that is a card that's always performed way better than it looks. So I think Sandstorm Scraper, especially in a deck that cares about golems or +1/+1 counters, has a chance. We also got Hostile Investigator, which this card, I'm pretty sure this one had to originally be an uncommon. So this big score set, remember, it was originally supposed to be an Aftermath set. And Aftermath had uncommons, rares, and mythics. But when Wizards moved these cards into the main set, rather than printing them on their own, they decided to just make all of them mythics. And I think Hostile Investigator, to me, this reads like a card that was probably an uncommon. So a 4-mana 4/3 Ogre Rogue Detective. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card. And then when 1 or more players discard 1 or more cards, investigate only once each turn. So Hostile Investigator, it's essentially a 4-mana Bugler Rat. A pretty sad Bugle, because 4 mana is just way too much for this effect. There would have been ways, I think, to make this good if, like, the discard was random, or there's this Alchemy card on Arena that's very similar to this. When it ETBs, it makes your opponent discard their highest mana value card. If it had something like that, then this card, I think, might actually be exciting. But I think it's a 4-mana 4/3, its stats aren't very good, and then its discard mode only targets one player, and it's pretty slow, and your opponent can just discard their extra land or whatever their worst card is. I guess it's nice that you do get a clue out of it, and making your opponent discard a card is targeting them, so it is committing a crime if that's relevant to your deck. But I actually think the Hostile Investigator probably close to unplayable, especially when you consider the competition. Like, remember, this card's coming into a standard where you got Archfiend to draw, so you got Sheoldred, and these cards aren't going to rotate this summer. Like, these are going to be around, so I just have a hard time imagining a world where I'd be like, I'm going to play this Hostile Investigator over some of the biggest, best black 4-drops in the format. I guess you could play it in like a discard commander deck, but even there, I'm not especially hyped about it because it's only one opponent that's being targeted. So for 4 mana, you're getting an underpowered 4/3 that's making a single opponent discard a single card rather than each opponent discard a card. Even if it said each opponent, then maybe I could see an argument for commander. I guess it is nice that it does work if you discard a card, but that mode only gives you a clue token, which is some nice value, but still, I don't know if it's going to be worth it to be like, when I loot, I get to make a clue token that I can spend 2 mana on to eventually draw a card with. So I think Hostile Investigator, to me, this just reads like a card that was originally designed to be kind of like a filler uncommon that ended up getting bumped up to Mythic because of how Wizards designed the set and decided to just make everything into Mythics when they moved it into Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So I don't know if I'm missing something, let me know in the comments, but I kind of feel like this card's just not especially playable. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoilers for today. So I think we have one more day to go. I believe we still have like 6 or 7 more big score cards that haven't been revealed yet, so we should get the rest of those, I assume, later today or tomorrow. So I'll be back tomorrow with one more video breaking down Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Until then, let me know which cards from today you're most hyped about. How good's that new Jitte? Is that gonna be anywhere close to the original? Whatever else you're hyped for, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe last night's Mucha Brew where we killed our opponent just by drawing cards.